Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Let's go to India, shall we? I want to find out what's going on in that country, and I haven't been there for 40 years. Uh, Maybe. Anyway, I have friends with me. My friend Shabir Gwynn is somebody I've known forever, and he's very active as an editor on Peace Magazine. And he, of course, he's from Calcutta, and he keeps in touch with things in India. And Dilip Simeon is also with us, and he is, where are you, Dilip?
I'm in Delhi.
You're in Delhi today. All right. Dilip Simeon is a retired professor of history, and he's spent some time in the U.S. I think you said Princeton.
Yes.
A little while back. Very good. So we will. I want you, if you will, Dilip, to give me some overview of what you see as the situation there in India and with the Modi government now.
One thing that we ought to make very clear is that the current government is quite different from any other kind of government. And the reason is that it's an ideologically motivated campaign. It's a product of a decades-long ideologically motivated campaign. And this campaign goes back more than 90 years. It's been spearheaded by something called the RSS, which is a Hindi word, term meaning, which stands for Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which means in English, National Volunteers. Now, this is a group which was formed in the early part of the 20th century, along with a host of other civil society organizations. It was not part of the Congress. The Congress was a broad platform. The Congress should not be confused with the Congress of today. It was not a political party in that sense. It called itself a Congress. It did not call itself a Congress party. It was not a party in that sense. It was an umbrella organization of all those who agreed that the British should leave the country eventually or make significant concessions towards self-government. So it was a nationalistic movement. The Congress was a nationalist movement directed at evicting the colonial power. But there were ideological movements which had a more finely tuned and explicit ideological program as to what they wanted. And that includes the communist movement, for whom the main aim of national liberation ought to be the final establishment of a people's republic, etc., something dominated by their ideology. And then there were a host of other movements of a casteist nature, which was simply struggling to protect the interests of this or that caste. I'm sure you're aware of the phenomenon of caste. And then there were different concepts of nationalism or of the community. And the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha were formed more or less the same time. The Hindu Mahasabha came in 1915, the RSS came a few years later, less than a decade later. But they were both oriented towards a different concept of what the Indian nation meant and ought to mean. So they were engaging in a form of mobilization which we call communal mobilization. Communal deriving from community. And the Muslim League, which was founded in 1909, also had a similar kind of approach, mobilizing the Muslim community. So behind both these ideological perspectives lay a very clear-cut ideal of homogeneity of this or that community. So to say we want a Hindu nation presumes that such a nation exists and is striving for sovereignty and power. And to say that we want Muslim interests protected presumes that all Muslims are a homogeneous group and that they have homogeneous interests, quote unquote interests. So therefore, in India, during the national movement, there was not simply an umbrella organization such as the Congress, which included a host of different perspectives, including communists and people whose sympathies lay with the Muslim League or with the Hindu Mahasabha. All of them were part of the Congress to some degree or the other, because that was an umbrella organization. But along with that, there were contesting concepts of what the future ought to unfold as. So you could say, in putting it in simple language, there was Indian nationalism, and along with it, there was Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism. So they were all in contestation with one another. And Hindu nationalism also is not a simple entity. There were people who were Hindu nationalists who believed in resuscitating a long suppressed Hindu culture, quote unquote, but who were not necessarily fascistically oriented. They were not oriented towards hating other communities, specifically the Muslim community and so on. There is another element of Hindu nationalism called Hindutva, and Hindutva means the essence of Hinduism. Of course, that's a name that they have given themselves. And this was put forward by a person called Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar, who is the central intellectual icon of the current government. All right? So Savarkar was also implicated in the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. He was a prime accused in the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, and he got let off on a technicality. So the point is that there is in India a constant tension between different forms of different concepts of the Indian nation. And the group that is now in power represents the group which was favored by Savarkar, represents the ideology favored by Savarkar. The ideology that Hindus have long been suppressed. Hindus are a community. If they are not, then they ought to be melded into one. They ought to be molded into one. So the idea of building a community and presuming there is a community, they are both self-contradictory ideas, but they sit together in all kinds of communal mobilization. A, the presumption that such a community exists. B, the impulse to create such a community. Now, as you know, Indian nationalism ended up in a terrible communal conflagration and the partition of the country, with one part of the country being skived off into Pakistan. Now, that the RSS was launched in 1925, I think, and the communists were also launched around the same time. The Hindu Mahasabha came a little bit before, but the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS are organizations which are motivated by this concept of Hindutva, spelt Hindutva. The latter part, Tattva. Tattva means essence. So Hindutva means Hindudom, or essence of Hinduism. And the idea is that India is a Hindu nation. India is primarily and originally a Hindu nation. All religions that have lived in India over the centuries and which owe allegiance to, whose origins lie outside India, like Christianity and Islam, and communism, they also included communism. So Christianity, Islam, and communism are modes of belief whose origins lie outside India. Whereas for Hindus, India is both what they say, the Pitra Bhumi and Punya Bhumi, which means it is the fatherland as well as the holy land. And therefore, Hindus are the original and legitimate owners of India. And everybody else, all these other tendencies live here on sufferance. And if they live here at all, they must live in accordance with the ideology of Hindutva. Now, this tendency acquired greater impulse with the Treaty of Versailles and its invention of a concept of national homelands. As you know, after the Paris Peace Treaty and Versailles Conference, you had a different kind of concept of national homelands. With the Paris Peace Treaty, in Europe, it happened that nation states are national homelands of nationally homogeneous entities, which, of course, we all know was a complete failure because people did not really exist in this way. I mean, in Vienna, people would speak 6 different languages. I mean, even in Switzerland today, there are people who speak 4 different languages. They are no less Swiss. But the Treaty of Versailles imposed this kind of doctrine. And this doctrine of nationalism, of a nation state as the homeland of a homogeneous ethnic entity, this doctrine was adopted wholesale in India by various communal politicians. So it received an impetus from what they thought is international legitimacy. And they pushed this, and right through say the 1920s and 30s, the whole idea was India is the homeland of Hindus, and everybody else must obey them or kowtow to them or accept the majority rule. So the concept of democracy as majority rule became very prominent. The word majority and minority means something very, very big in India.
Okay.
So majority, now majority is just an arithmetical term. It depends on what you're counting. You could be counting city dwellers and village dwellers. You could be counting men and women. You could be counting over 18 and under 18. But in India, we are always counting Hindus and Muslims. That's all we count. Okay. So majoritarianism became the basis of the Hindutva claim. We are the majority. Now they also have to strive to make all Hindus agree that they should belong to this common homogeneous plank. That is the sticking point. They have never been able to get the bulk of the Hindus to agree that they and they alone are the representatives. It's rather like the Communist Party claiming to represent the working class.
Yeah, okay.
That's just a claim. I mean, you can't say that because your philosophy tells you that you represent the working class, therefore the working class must agree with your philosophy. It doesn't, and that's what they're still engaged in doing. So why is it different from any other party? Because it's a program for totalitarian tyranny. Totalitarianism is the tyranny of an idea, of an ideology.
Okay.
That's what's different. And they are in power now, and they're carrying on the efforts to infect the entire institutional framework of India. We maintain the facade of a liberal democratic republic with functioning legal and police institutions. But if you examine it closely, there's a huge amount of impunity for crimes, and there's a large amount of vigilante violence. Okay.
Tell me about the RSS.
Civil society and social service organization simultaneously as being a vigilante organization. It's both things, all right? They have fronts in society. It's rather like a classical Stalinist conception of the vanguard party. It's Stalinism in reverse. It's Stalinism, but with a communal ideology instead of communist ideology. All right. So any Stalinist organization maintains fronts. So it has a women's front, it has a peace front, it has a students' front, it has a trade union front, etc. You have front organizations to work in various segments of society. You see, and there's always the element of what you call plausible deniability. If something goes wrong, if someone does something wrong, you say it's just a front, or we don't have anything to do with that. All right. So at the center of it is a central committee. So the RSS forms the center, the heart of all these fronts. And the BJP is just one such front.
But the BJP is a party.
It's a party, but it is a front of the RSS. It is controlled by the RSS. Its top members are of the RSS. The Prime Minister of the RSS, the Home Minister belongs to the RSS. A large number of their ministers belong to the RSS. So a man can stand next to a policeman and talk about shooting anti-national elements and resorting to and encouraging violence, and there will be no police case registered against him. People can storm into Jawaharlal Nehru University campus and beat up other people and so on, and there'll be no police case. There's a high level of impunity, which means that the police has been directed. There is no independent prosecution, you see, in this country. So police cases are registered and concocted when there is no basis for it. You see, in India, the punishment lies in the registration of the case. The case may end in your being acquitted, but you may languish in jail for 10 years, or you may be implicated in court cases for years on end. It happened to me. I was implicated in a completely fabricated court case for 7 years, long years ago. So the point is that if the police is not functioning independently and autonomously, it's not functioning in a manner to protect and serve the citizens according to law, but it is applying the law and its power selectively in order to pursue the partisan interests of the party in power, which, mind you, has happened even with prior parties. I'm not simply accusing this party. I was in Delhi in 1984 when there was a mass riot in the aftermath of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. It was a state-sponsored pogrom. Literally, for something like 72 hours, the rioting mobs were given full freedom to do whatever they wanted. And up to 3,000 or 4,000 people were killed, murdered. And after that, the government and the police functioned in a manner calculated to save the wrongdoers and the criminals. They did this in 1984, 85, and a whole lot of us ran campaigns for justice. We ran campaign for 10 years for justice, but no justice is forthcoming. So you see, this is a deep-rooted problem in Indian society. It's just that these people now in power, all right, they also have an ideology. At that time, it was simply, hooliganism let loose. This is hooliganism with a purpose. This is hooliganism with an ideological orientation. And the orientation is towards building a totalitarian state apparatus.
Okay, I hear you and I believe you, but I also wonder, you're couching it as a problem in Indian society or Indian culture or something, that it's in long-standing. And my inclination is to see that things of this kind are happening all around the world. I mean, India is not alone, but certainly India is part of a tendency that a populist right-wing tendency that occurs in many countries. We certainly have, I'm very familiar, of course, with the situation in the US under Trump, but then there's also Brazil with Bolsonaro, there's Duterte in the Philippines, there are people in Hungary, there are people in Poland, and so on. I can't even begin to enumerate the countries that are affected by this kind of thing. So I keep looking at this moment in history as somehow puzzling, but as something that is not just a local, unique phenomenon, but is part of some sort of movement, a historical movement that I don't understand. That you say that, of course, things like this have happened before in India, and certainly I wouldn't contest that. But what is your understanding of the reason for this particular moment in history to becoming so extremist?
See, I totally get what you're saying. In fact, that is what I myself say repeatedly. I've said it on my blog also, that this is not peculiar to India. In fact, I've written a whole essay on, I call it a brief history of Indian fascism, which I can easily send you, in which I place the situation in India in a world context. That's why I mentioned the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles and so on, and their doctrine of majoritarianism. The doctrine of majoritarianism appeared in the Treaty of Versailles. It was given international legal standing. All right. So I totally understand that. Now that became the crucible for the evolution of many right-wing movements. All in the 1930s. After all, now in the 1930s, there were right-wing movements in Europe. And those right-wing movements then came to power and fruition in fascism, Nazism, etc., etc., and we know the consequences. All those movements had a great impact in India. In fact, the group in power now, their icon, V.D. Savarkar, was approvingly quoted in the Nazi press, and he made several statements to the effect that the minority has to go. He even said clearly, what did the Jews do in Germany? They were in a minority, so they had to be suppressed and removed. So he talked like this. And all this kind of attitude was given due legitimacy by the language of minority treaties and the language of majoritarianism, etc., which began with the treaty of the aftermath of the Paris peace treaties. Okay. So I agree that this is the tendency which is going on all over the world. It waxes and wanes. It gains strength sometimes and loses strength sometimes. And that poses a very big problem for a historian. I'm a historian. I teach a history course which stems across all these continents. Okay, I'm aware of this. So one point I will make is that there is a crisis of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy does not have a powerful enough philosophy to hold it together coherently. Liberalism began in late 19th century as the flagship of free trade, free imperialist trade. I mean, the Opium War in China, or the controversy over the imposition of duties and tariffs in India. All these controversies, the imperial power was talking about free trade. They were talking about freedom. The word liberalism comes from liberty. So when they talked about freedom, they meant liberty for the capitalists and the mercantilists, liberty for the imperial power. It's the social democratic movement and the labor movement that then incorporated the concept of liberty into itself. So you find the development of social democracy, which included the suffragette movement. You find alongside these authoritarian tendencies, there was also the tendency of a fight for democratic rights for labor, the labor movement. And that took many forms. I mean, you had the Wobblies, the workers, the industrial workers of the world. In the USA, you had a strong, powerful anarchist movement in the USA, but you also had reformist trade union movements. So what I'm saying is that all the questioning and curiosity and examination of these questions of populism is just a style of rhetoric. Populism is not a doctrine. It's a rhetorical style. It's a rhetorical style which invokes something called the people.
Yeah.
And the struggle is to incorporate its notion of the people into the accepted pop notion of the people. So if I can define the people as Hindus, I can leave out other sections of the people. So to put it in a formulaic version, do the people define the nation, or does the nation define the people? If the people define the nation, it's territorial nationalism. All of us, we belong to the nation. And we figure out a way of speaking about ourselves. If the nation defines the people, it implies that a group of select intellectuals invent an ideology which they then thrust upon you and ask you to accept as your self-definition.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is happening across the world, correct? And it's happening as part of the crisis of capitalism. And the trouble is that all the theoreticians of political theory, some of whom are very brilliant, and I'm incidentally a great admirer of Leo Strauss, who's supposed to be a conservative, enlightened conservative. I'm a great admirer of his. I've learned a great deal from him. And I do not accept that he's right-wing at all. I don't think he... In fact, Alexander Kozhev, who was the leading Stalinist in the 1930s and 40s, the only man he considered his equal was Leo Strauss. So Leo Strauss was communicating with Alexander Kozhev in Paris during the height of the McCarthy era. He was just a great teacher and a great philosopher.
Well, tell me
But
a little about that, because he's just a name to me. I certainly have people who refer to him, but I've never read a word that he wrote. And I wondered, are you suggesting that he had some insight into the relationship between capitalism and the this kind of
no,
liberal democracy that
he
no?
didn't. He didn't, and that's why I raised his name. I said these are people from whom I've learned a great deal about political theory and political philosophy. But I find that all of them, they don't. Hannah Arendt tangentially takes up the question of capitalism. She does, origins of totalitarianism, etc. She does.
Yeah.
But by and large, you find all these great thinkers are focused still mainly on the West, on Western philosophy, Western crises, and they do not take up the question of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. They don't. Now, this is very relevant. They leave it out. In fact, Mike Davies has written an excellent book called Late Victorian Holocaust. And he, mind you, is a journalist. He wrote that book on Los Angeles, city of lights or whatever, forget that. But he's written an excellent book, a history book, on the famines, the man-made famines that swept through China and India and other parts of the world in mid and late 19th century, and how these famines were entirely preventable, but they happened because of imperial colonial policy. Okay, literally millions died. So he takes up the question of capitalism and colonialism, but many of these other philosophers don't, which is, I see, a major flaw. So what I'm trying to say, to put it in a very brief nutshell, is that the question of liberty, and by liberty, I don't mean liberty for capitalists and mercantilists, liberty for the people. The democracy is not just majority rule. It's also the rule of law. It's freedom of the press, the freedom to speak. It's the freedom to express yourself, the freedom of trade unions, of mobilization, of demonstration without fear. It's many things. Liberal democracy means all these things. It does not simply mean majority rule.
I hope not. Yes, you're right.
All right. And in many of these populist movements, it's reduced to majority rule. You left out Erdogan. Erdogan is imprisoning every single journalist and professor who disagrees with him. They find themselves in jail. So, because he has the majority. All right. So, he's destroying democracy in the name of the majority. You invoke the majority to destroy democracy. This is what happened in Germany also. I mean, the Jewish population in Germany was less than 1% of the population. Yet the Aryans were depicted as being victims of this less than 1% of the population. Okay. So what I'm saying is that you have populism running amok, and the social democratic experiment failed. And that's a huge story. But because of the Bolshevik revolution, and Bolshevism is a form of authoritarianism, it's a form of totalitarianism. Because social democracy was co-opted, or let us say confiscated by Bolshevism, therefore the social democratic alternative ran into an arid desert. The communist movement played a very big role in defeating the Axis powers. They're very good at resistance. All right. So they played a very big role in the underground against Nazism, whether in Greece or in France or in Italy, wherever. They they tried to fight off Franco in the Spanish Civil War. So the communist movement played a very big role, but then it faltered. And what went wrong? That's a very big issue, which all these professors don't take into account. So I'm saying
now the communist part of this equation is pretty much past. And if you're going to attribute it to economic issues at all, it has to be some crisis of capitalism. But I don't quite see how you're going to derive the emphasis on ethnicity or tribalism or religious communities, that kind of identity politics. From an analysis of the crisis of capitalism today. I don't see any linkage, but if you can make the linkage, I want to hear it.
I'll try to make the linkage. See, capitalism is a global system. but there is a contradiction between the global nature of the capitalist economy and the local nation-statist nature of political demography. Political demography of necessity has to be focused on control of localized populations, whether according to the patchwork of nation states. So there is an inherent built-in tension between the global nature of capitalism and the nation-statist nature of political demography. So this tension, it cannot exist otherwise, because that's how the system grew. So what is happening is that political demography is subject to or moves in channels which are most convenient to it. So that if you have a crisis, an economic crisis, which requires authoritarian measures, which requires firm, even tyrannical measures on behalf of corporates, on behalf of the global market, then you develop a schizophrenic mode of discourse. You have number crunching for the corporates, and you have temples and communal agitations and culture wars for the public. That's what's happening across the world. After all, Donald Trump is talking about white genocide, and he's basically a Ku Klux Klan man in power. And he is actually, behind the scenes, what is actually going on? It's planting judges in the judicial system and completely corrupting the judicial system. And if you look carefully, the most of the economic decisions pertain to tax breaks for the rich, even more tax breaks for the rich. And secondly, completely deregulating oil and energy. He's dismantled the regulatory apparatus. So that is what is going on. There's petrodollars, which is interested in dismantling regulation. The thrust of international capitalism is to escape regulation. It's very interesting. We may know all the relevant facts about global warming and still do nothing. We know that burning the Amazon forest concerns the whole world, but the Brazilian government will say Amazon lies in Brazil, so it's our business. So both time and space and water and forests have been nationalized. You can't nationalize. Can you imagine a man like Donald Trump saying, it's so cold here, why are we talking about global warming? It's not warm, it's cold. The idiot does not know that global temperature is global temperature. It's not temperature in Canada. That's how it is.
Now you said something interesting, that that politics is really territorial, geographic, that you have to draw maps with circles on them or lines on them to tell people where they vote and where their allegiances should lie and so on. To me, that you've struck a nerve there, because this has been a concern of mine for 35, 40 years, that I feel that the only solution to this, what you've painted as a real clash between two different principles of social organization, the global and the territorial political, that the solution to it has to be to transform the political into non-territorial systems of influence and decision making, so that you and I are now talking from one country to another, but you might as well be in the next room. For all practical purposes, doesn't matter to me where you are, and I feel that we have more and more interests in common that are simply not relevant to our locality. I have very little interest, frankly, in the politics of my city or my neighborhood, or even I had a hard time voting a couple of days ago for the new government of Canada, because my heart is not there. I'm much more interested in the issues that are international in scope, and certainly I would have thought that the pandemic would make it very clear to people that lines on a map don't mean a damn thing, but it hasn't made people clear to it, and it doesn't seem to be, at least as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem to be altering the perception that we are one people internationally, and that the whole planet is one humankind. I don't get that sense that is growing much, but the only way I can see making a dent in that is to bring people together on the basis of their particular interests, and allow them to aggregate votes and make decisions based on concerns, special the concerns of whether we're interested in the environment, whether we're interested in travel, whatever, the various economic concerns and so on that are not local in nature. But how to move to institutions that reflect that, political institutions that reflect that, really, I don't know how to get from here to there.
Well, there have been many attempts at making international linkages. These have been going on ever since the foundation of the Comintern and the international labor movement was international, avowedly international. So that is going back. Even the French Revolution had internationalist implications and had international repercussions. So the concept of a supranational interest, a supranational human interest, has got an old history. It's not something relatively new. All right. It's just that you do have that, and at the same time, you also have localistic, particularistic, the cult of the particular, the cult of the unique, that is also developing. And many times the two coexist in an uneasy alliance. The Bolshevik Revolution began with a universalist banner, but then it retreated into itself and became inward-looking. All right. So there are many reasons for that, which we can't go into now. But I'm saying that the tradition of international effort directed at some common humanitarian goal, the tradition of looking upon humanity as one big family, is an old tradition. But it has been countered by the anti-establishment tradition. You might find it interesting to read a book by an Israeli scholar, historian of ideas called Ziv Sternhell. It's called the anti-establishment tradition, in which he locates, of all people, Edmund Burke as one of the founders of neoconservatism, because of his extreme anger and wish to stoke up a military crushing of the French Revolution. So this you find that so this tendency of conservatism, which later on grew into a powerful particularistic trend where you stress singularity, all right, you stress the particular, you stress nationalism. Whereas the Enlightenment talked about universal values, you have another Enlightenment, or it's not an Enlightenment, but another version of modernity, in which you are prepared to let technology develop, but technology for the service of particularistic ends. In fact, there's another scholar called Jeffrey Herf who's written about a book called with the title Reactionary Modernism. So you have conservative radicalization, or the radicalization of conservatism. And that suits the purpose of those ideologies have fitted into the program of the corporates, of the petrochemical industry or the nuclear industry. There are various big banks that have invested in the nuclear industry, and we know the nuclear industry is basically oriented towards armaments. Okay, so now if this is the situation, we find that the capitalist system is whenever it finds itself in a difficult position, it goes towards those political ideologies which can give it leverage over state power, which leverage is to be used to defend their interests. That's why people like Donald Trump would get the support of certain corporates. That's why even now stalling of certain packages by the Biden government is being done by the big pharmaceutical companies, etc. So the arms industry.
It's easy to look at the ways in which financial interests are dominating. What is troubling is to see that the general population is so influenced by these things and so easily misled, so that you cannot count on the voters to make good judgments. You cannot count. I mean, Donald Trump might even get reelected. I don't know. It's not out of the question. 40% of the U.S. population would like it right now. But the fact that he almost won, it's a shocking thing. Well, I presume one could say the same thing about India, that you are not finding enough resistance to the kinds of trends that you've been describing so well. That
no, you do have resistance. It's just that state power is very powerful. So if you use, on the one hand, you reduce educational budgets, you make people run around for food, and you make people run around for oxygen cylinders. People in a desperate situation. Look, Stalinist Russia during the 5-year plan was a country in complete turmoil. Everybody was living in camps. Everything, both collectivization of a society which is in disintegration loses its bonds of community and is incapable of maintaining its spine against a tyrant. So tyranny is consciously built up. They conquer state power, they misuse the police, they misuse the media, they terrorize journalists, they terrorize intellectuals, they put you in jail. So there's a conscious effort at stifling public opinion and doing away with democracy.
Well, all I can say is it's awfully easy to do it, because they sure have done a good job of it in the US. When you get the kinds of acceptance of crazy ideas that, people fund the very weapons that are going to be killing them. People refuse the vaccines that they need to save their lives. What else can you look for as insanity? It didn't take much to get people to an irrational point of view on a large scale, to such an extent that you can't really run a democracy that way. If you don't have people who can talk sensibly, what are you going to do about it? That's the terrible thing.
Let me take a slightly different tack on this, just for providing food for thought. That also there's a current within in the history of the intellect. There's a current of ideas which nowadays goes by the name of identity politics or multiculturalism or postmodernism or post-truth, etc., etc. And this current of ideas has been assiduously built up for the last 30 or 40 years, in which the very idea of truth has been, quote unquote, deconstructed. So that in order to appear democratic, we must agree that every zany and insane idea is as good or as bad as any other. This approach to ideas, where we say, oh, truth is repressive. This is all Derrida, Foucault, all these people have been, their ideas have been channeled in a political direction to establish some kind of concept that there is no truth. Nietzsche made this famous comment, what is truth? It's just a mobile army of metaphors. So there is no truth. We are living in a post-truth world. So in this kind of relativistic atmosphere, where any assertion is as good as any other assertion, where a woman representing the president of the USA can appear and say, we have alternative facts. This is a culture which has also been contributed to by a section of, by a significant intellectual current, which has been going on for the last 30, 40 years.
Well, I would like to attribute it to that, because it makes sense what you're saying, and I completely share your values. But I don't know. I think postmodernism was a flash in the pan. I don't think it has a whole lot of influence now.
Flourishing in my country, in that certain sections of liberal, especially in the English language departments, they go on about multiple narratives, and I simply ask them, multiple narratives is all very well, but is global warming correct or incorrect? Does it happen or does it not happen? Or are you going to construct multiple narratives about it? There is such a thing as truth. And if you say, if it's one thing to say that access to truth is difficult and many people have different perspectives on the truth, there's another thing to say that there's no such thing as truth. It's a pointless exercise. So that, and repeatedly I've asked people this question, please put forward a different way of looking at these issues, linguistic philosophy, but they don't do it.
No, I don't think, I mean, I can't agree with you that that is the explanation for this kind of rise of, for example, white sovereignty, white sovereignty in the US. These people are real Nazis, and Nazism wasn't caused by postmodernism.
No, not at all. I'm not at all as I said, I just wanted to throw one more element into the mix. All right, where we must be tolerant of everything, including Nazism. I'm not tolerant of Nazism. That's why I said truth. Someone says truth is repressive. I said, yes, truth is repressive of superstition, of lies, of propaganda, of insanity. It is. It has to be. All right. So I'm not, say, now racism has an old tradition in the USA. And this racism has been duly co-opted into the entire system. What Trump and Trumpism have done is make explicit what was implicit.
Yeah, make it legal to say it where it was shameful to say it 10 years ago. Yeah, I quite agree.
Yeah.
I'm not. One other question I have is.
Okay.
I have a question is apparently the popularity of Modi has been dropping quite a bit. And I wonder whether you have any ideas about where do you think this is going, and if there's any chance that the government might change.
I am not a prophet. I used to be a prophet when I was in my 20s, but I ceased being a prophet. I have no idea where it's going. But the thing is that, yes, the pandemic had a terrible impact. But they control the statistics, they control the reporting. People will be dying of COVID and they will be taken to the cremation ground and be registered as he fell sick. All right. And in India, remember that India is an overwhelmingly agricultural and rural economy and society. There are no registers of births and deaths kept uniformly across the country. Many people die. They're ashamed of admitting that they've died of this thing, or they're terrified of going and reporting it anywhere. Thousands and thousands of people were given water burials in the Ganges recently. The government merely said, we Hindus, we do water burials, but not on this scale. All right. So, I mean, there's enough data to show that the figures and statistics of the people affected by this pandemic and the number of deaths are several times higher than what the government is prepared to admit. You can look for it online and find various sources to show that. You know, I don't want to go there, but the fact is that the pandemic hit many people, and it hit people regardless of whether they were voters of his or anybody else. So there are even members of the RSS and supporters of Modi who said, you know, we can't get oxygen for our parents. What the hell are you talking about? Now, you have reporters who are saying that there's a shortage here. They get arrested. You get arrested for telling the truth. You get promoted for telling lies. So you can control all this. So people are disaffected. Now, all the government can do, this government, these people in power have only a one-line solution to everything. That is communal propaganda. Hatred. Like in North America, Trump and company can only stir up hatred against strangers and black and brown people. Similarly, these people, the only single point agenda they have is culture wars and hatred for Muslims and Christians and communists and critics and so on. And they will start it again. Now, what will happen as a result of all this, I can't say. Because as you said, I mean, as Metta said, people are susceptible and they've shown themselves capable of falling for all this bullshit repeatedly. And it's happened in my country also. But keep in mind that in my country, the majority never was unitedly in support of this government. The majority was on the other side, but it was fragmented. They managed to build up a coherent enough bloc, and you have the first past the post system here. You don't have proportional representation or anything like that. So if you win even 21% of the votes and everybody, all the rest of the 79% are divided among a dozen people, then you win. Okay, so that's the situation. Now they tried that in Bengal recently. They even managed to control the election commission behavior. I'll give you concrete examples. Elections should take place within a limited amount, reasonably limited amount of time, limited by the logistical difficulties. All right, like managing the election in a large area and so on. But you had an election which lasted for 2 months in Bengal. Now, why did that happen? In some other parts of the country, the election lasted just a few days. In Bengal, it lasted for 2 months. Why? It lasted for 2 months because they need that time to tweak and fine-tune their messaging and take care of the whole election area by area to see to it that they get the maximum benefit. Even
How
that
did they
failed.
do? But they didn't win anyway, did they?
But they won twice or thrice the number of seats that they did, that they would have done. So they can do anything. I don't put anything past them. You'll have a person of one caste standing, let us say an opposition candidate standing in one constituency. They will pick a dozen other candidates of the same caste, some of them with the same name, and put him up against that same person. So the public gets completely confused and the votes go all over the place and they win. So I don't put anything past them. They are focused. They have got a Nietzschean urge to be in power at all costs.
Okay, but tell me where you see any ray of hope in terms of the organization of opposition to that, or alternative methods of resisting the trends. Do you see anybody or any groups of people who stand out as offering any kind of leadership?
Yeah, well, recently there's been a 1-year-long farmers' agitation in India, and it's affected farmers all over the country. Now, this word farmer also is a nomenclature which has come into use over the last 20 years. We call them peasants. There are rich peasants, poor peasants, landless peasants. We call them, we have a peasantry in this country, but now we call them farmers for some reason. Okay. So this is how language is manipulated by the press. Anyway, leave that aside. The peasant community, including the rich peasant community, has been agitating for well over 1 year. And hundreds of thousands of them have been camped outside Delhi and for many, many months. And they have been conducting an agitation against the so-called farm laws. Now, these farm laws were passed in the interests of agro-business. Ultimately, these farm laws, and the peasants say that we are fighting to save the country. You handed over everything. Most big airports are now contracted out to some of the big corporates in the country. So most of the big public sector units, enterprises are being sold off. They're doing what is called disinvesting. So they're basically corporatizing and handing over even public sector enterprises to private capitalists. The one big zone that remains is agriculture. So if you can make the peasantry subordinate to corporate control of agriculture, and then we don't have big vegetable markets where everything is wrapped in cellophane and placed in a big supermarket. We buy vegetables on the street from a poor fellow who runs a little table and he has all the vegetables you need. That's how we conduct it. And they're supplied by there's a whole patchwork network of supply and demand. All that will be abolished and the corporates will take over this. They'll have big places, warehouses with for freezing fresh vegetables and sell them at different points of time. It's a scheme for the takeover of agriculture. And the peasants know this and they've been fighting it. And they're openly speaking over the time that I've been watching it. Because the mainstream media doesn't report them, a whole host of informal media has sprung up. using YouTube, etc., etc.
Really?
And they have been speaking. And if you look at the number of hits, there are literally millions of them. There are scores of little groups where the most ordinary and humble of farmers and people have been speaking. And they're saying that all you know how to do is divide us. We know what you're doing. They say, our people go and our sons from our families are standing on the border, because many of them come from Punjab and Haryana, and then many of those people are people whose sons are in the army. The army is recruited from among the peasantry. All right. And they say, we've even got recordings of sons of the farmers saying, when I am dressed as a soldier and standing at the front, then you say I'm a patriot. Because I'm here standing with my father, you say I'm an anti-national element and opposed to the national interest. All right. So this has been a very powerful movement. And the government is shaken. There are parts of Haryana where they can't even, the government ministers can't even go there. They'll be chased away. They block the highways. It's happening.
Well, what about their allies? Are they recruiting support from other sectors of society, merchants or local, teachers, or are there other sectors of society that support the farmers? Are they growing, or are they losing support?
I think they're growing. More and more people realize that, the farming community has huge links. It's a gigantic social network. So still in India, the fallback solution for any poor person in the city is to go home to his village. The village is a social safety net. There's no social security system. There's no formal social security system. There's no insurance. If many people who work in the cities, even the cleaning lady who comes to my house, her village is 1,000 miles away in Jharkhand. She goes back there for a holiday. They come back and work here. So people in the cities, the working class population of the cities, an overwhelming proportion of them have got links with the countryside.
And what do they say about Modi?
There is a strong sense that this is a gigantic con artist.
Really? All right. Well, bless you. This is bracing news. Shabir, you've been sitting quietly. You should have maybe I'll give you the final word.
He's my uncle. By the way, he's my uncle.
Yeah, okay. That. Yeah. I knew you were related, but I wasn't sure how. Shabir.
Well, there's not very much I can say, except that I was pleased that the popularity of Modi is waning, and people are beginning to recognize that he's bringing a lot of harm to the country. And all I can say is one hopes that things will change.
Well, I hope so
That's
too.
all I can say that.
Okay. Well, I will. This has been very enlightening to me, and it's such an interesting conversation that I see it in connection to worldwide trends. Yes. And but obviously, it's a special case, certainly a unique situation. So thank you both very, very much. I've enjoyed this, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope I have another conversation with you another time.
No, I'll be very happy. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Wonderful. Bye, Dilip.
Bye.